Thank you very much for coming tonight and welcome to this launch of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Mobility report, Social Mobility Gold Spots, Capital Mobility. My name is Jonathan Simons. I'm the Chair of Education here at Policy Exchange, and it's my pleasure to be chairing tonight's seminar and introducing a fantastic panel. We have here tonight three outstanding speakers. The first person who will be speaking is the Right Honourable Baroness Morris of Yardley, Estelle Morris, former Education Secretary from 2001 to 2002, and also a teacher of 18 years standing and a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Mobility. Second person who's speaking is Damien Hines MP, Member of Parliament for East Hampshire, again a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group and a former member of the Education Select Committee. And the two of them are going to present tonight's report to you. And then responding to that report and kicking off with some observations of our own before general Q&A, we have Dr. Rebecca Allen, who's a reader in the Economics of Education at the Institute of Education and a well-known academic in the field of education more broadly. So a really, really high-quality panel tonight. The format, as I said, is both Estelle and Damien are going to talk for 5 to 10 minutes about the report and about the context more broadly. Then Becky's going to give her responses, and then we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A. So without any ado, can I open up to Baroness Morris?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that. Thank you for giving me the chance to look back. I think I'm doing the before bit of a before and after presentation, and Damien's doing the after bit. So I have to be very careful I don't get the reminiscence bit. But what I did want to do, I mean, what Damien suggested that I did was just remind people of why the London Challenge was set up and what the context was at the time. Because there's a real danger that you look at the results and interpret it against what we know now, not where it started, and reflect on those things that have happened in between. I think Damien's done a wonderful, I think you'll see when you see his presentation, that the analysis he's done of the statistics is really remarkable and is deserving of a really good discussion. What I want to do is to just set out not what it used to be like, but what were the drivers that made us set up London Challenge in the first place, and what both educational and political challenges we were trying to meet. First of all, we set up the London Challenge. It got launched, I think, in 2003 proper. That's when it started. But I think I launched it at a North London school in about 2001, if not 2002. But even that was not its roots. And I think it's worth just looking back a little bit on that. When Labour came to power in 97, you might remember that it predominantly concentrated on early years and literacy and numeracy strategy. So the work that had been done and the progress that had been made really revolved around the 0s to 11s. In truth, it really didn't have a secondary school change strategy by the time of the 2001 election. And London Challenge sat very much within that political necessity to try and sort out what we were doing about secondary school reform. Second point was that the results were beginning to rise. I think you'll see from Damien's evidence that the results in London didn't start to increase when London Challenge came on the scene. They actually started to go up prior to that. So there were things that had happened before that London Challenge latched onto, and it's worth just remembering that. And I would just pick out 2 or 3 as being particularly important. The literacy and the numeracy strategy was particularly beneficial to London because they had so far to go. I think what I now think of those 2 strategies looking back, that they probably did as much as they were ever going to do by about 2004, and there should have been a change of policy at that point. But the low-lying fruit of grossly underperforming schools and really badly performing local authorities came through within that period. So they latched onto literacy and numeracy. The second thing they latched onto, which was really important, was things like education action zones and excellence in cities. Because what happened in 97 when we had the change of government, one of the key drivers that Labour was trying to achieve was to get schools working together again. With the introduction of inspection and a market approach to education and schools competing against each other for children and therefore for money, the threads that had bound schools together under the old days of local authority control had gone, and in many cases rightly so, and nothing had actually taken its place. So one of the chief challenges we had in 97 was, how do you get schools working together again, sharing good practice, having the competition, but having the support and challenge as well? And how do you get schools working with the other agencies that also affect children's learning? And the 2 97 to 2001 initiatives I would pick out for that was first education action zones, which we learnt from and then moved on from, and then excellence in cities. And if you made me choose one initiative that London Challenge grew out of, I would say it was excellence in cities. It was like that on a bigger, greater, more ambitious scale. But any of you who are serious studies of this, it's worth looking at the 6 strands that made up excellence in cities. And what I think we did with London was many more strands than that. So we got to 2001, and there were a number of imperatives. Firstly, standards in London were really, really low. And those of you who are old enough or have got good memories will remember that every time the league tables were published, you could write the headlines ahead of time. It was Hackney and Islington, worst local authorities in the whole of the country. Why would you want to educate your children there? Politically, it was very unfortunate, and most of the journalists lived in Hackney and Islington. And so there was absolutely no doubt that we had underperforming local authorities elsewhere, which we did. They were never going to get as much publicity as Hackney and Islington. And that's an important point to remember, that Labour believed, and it was true, and it's true, the Tories to some extent, that our national education policy was judged by what we did in London. So those, I think, were the 2 driving forces to do. So 3. Firstly, we were moving on to secondary school reform. Secondly, the results in London for all the progress were still dire, absolutely dire. There's a flight to the private sector. And thirdly, we were really conscious politically that we would be judged by what we did in London. So that's sort of what we were building on. And those were the drivers. In terms of what we were trying to do, I remember saying once, and this is it's not a learned way of saying it, but I think it's the best way. What we thought we'd do is, what would happen if we put everything we were trying to do and tried it all in one area? Because what we tended to do, if we did education action zones, not everyone got one. If we did excellence in cities, not everyone had it. If we did Sure Start, not every community got one. So what tends to happen is the initiatives you do, apart from literacy and numeracy, were not nationally rolled out. They tended to go in the urban areas and the underperforming rural areas. But part of our thought was, what happens if you get one geographical area and you do all those things that you're doing in different parts of the United Kingdom? And that, I think, was the big, if you like, it was the big idea, to concentrate all our forces on one geographical area. The last thing I'd sort of want to say is the number of things that we thought would be important to begin with. And again, you have to remember the times. We were at the times when local authorities were stronger than they are now, but they were not flavour of the month. Some local authorities in London had been particularly poor, and the London boroughs had long forgotten that they were ever part of the Greater London Council because they weren't therefore actually working with each other. So our biggest decision, and I never thought it was a risk because I think it was absolutely essential, but I think for Downing Street, one of the biggest risks they took was to actually appoint a London Commissioner for Education in the face of Tim Brighouse and David Woods, who was his number 2, and they worked in Birmingham, and they came and they worked in London. And the reason that was important, for the first time, it gave some leadership across the London boroughs, because London Challenge wasn't about picking one local authority off against the other, and there's nothing that held the London boroughs together except the London Challenge. So I would have that as that, and it was quality leadership. The second thing about that leadership is really important. It was solid education leadership. It wasn't political leadership. So we didn't make the mistake we made with the literacy and numeracy strategy, which was convert a really good education policy into a political policy, and thereby actually change the way it was perceived. Part of the reason for appointing Tim and David was that they were educationists. And although we always had a minister who had ownership for it, we tossed and turned a lot to begin with. I'm not absolutely sure how it worked out, but we thought of not basing Tim or David in the Department for Education, so it wouldn't be seen as another top-down initiative. I think what happened, they got a room in my day in the Institute of Education, but they were constant visitors to the Department for Education. And one of the other reasons that was important is because the major criticism against Labour at that time was that it was nanny state, it was top-down, and teachers didn't have a lot of time for us, and much of what we did, even if it was meant to be supportive of teachers, was perceived as being a burden on teachers. So in the bodies of Tim and David, we actually got a leadership that was as far away from New Labour and Downing Street as you could imagine, and they already had respect and they already had knowledge. And I think that leadership was very, very important. What I think happened then, and then I had this last bit, Damien, for you to get ready. What I think happened then is that they did rigorously and vigorously and with great, as robust as you could, all the things that we'd found worked between 97 and 2001. And importantly, all the things they found had worked in Birmingham between 1992, when Tim arrived in Birmingham, and the time we were in there, which was 2001. So the use of data, if David Woods was here now and I said, give me one thing that made the London Challenge, he would say it was data. Data, 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 looking at the data and responding to it. What I would say was the biggest thing. If I had to just choose things, and I'll finish on this because it's 2 in 1, nothing improves unless you improve the quality of teaching. Everything else has to be servant to improving the quality of teaching and the quality of school leadership. And the minute the London Challenge got going and was seen to be successful, and we were beginning to put in some academies at that point, it seemed to be a bit of a formula for attracting some of the nation's best teachers to come and live and work in London. And that had been a difficult task, to try and get the best to work in the most challenging schools. And London Challenge did that. It became a place to be. If I'd have been a young teacher, I was in 74, I went to work in the inner city in Coventry after 74, I would have flocked to London at the start of the 2000s and odds. It was the place to be for excitement and doing good and doing something that nobody else would do. So there's a collection of things. The leadership was right, and that leadership helped maintain the right environment. We got the politics right in a way that we didn't, often very early in 97. But more importantly, it wasn't flash. It wasn't just headlines. It was solid school improvement, peer-to-peer support, getting the right leadership in place, acting quickly if it looked as though a school wasn't performing, not being frightened by what the data showed you, and facing up to failure and celebrating success. And my last sentence is this, because it's just worth saying. I think those of us who've been involved in London Challenge have known it's been a success story for 5 or 6 years now. I do reflect on the society we live in, that they've only just realised it in the last 12 months. But I think that anything that we can do to show that we have a success story here in our capital that we should be really proud of and we should really shout. And in doing that, I think we give a lot of confidence to many areas of the country who are still struggling to try to get where London has got to over the last 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Estelle. Damien.
Thank you. And, oh, yes, I need that. Thank you. Thank you very much to Jonathan and to Policy Exchange for hosting this. And thank you all for being here, and to Becky for being our expert academic in residence, but for what I think is going to be a really, really interesting discussion. It is an interesting discussion around what is one of the biggest questions, one of the biggest challenges in education and social mobility in this country today. Because if we could bottle and replicate London in the rest of the country, we would have been having a very different conversation last week about the PISA results. We wouldn't quite have solved the social mobility problem that we have in this country, but we would be quite a long way down that road. It's a great privilege to follow Estelle, who speaks on these subjects not only with a great depth of experience and expertise, but also, I think, with a level of empathy with both families and teachers, which is unrivaled. We're an all-party group. We have, I'm going to see Meg Hillier, one of my Labour colleagues, here with us as well. We work across issues in social mobility and try to find ways in which politicians might have something useful to say from time to time. And so we have a strand at the moment about character and resilience, and how helping young people to develop strength of character and so on is very important to social mobility. We have another about networks and contacts and the important role that plays in social mobility. And this is the third one, what we call goldspots. And the project that is now Capital Mobility started life as a search for places, business sectors, schools, universities, whatever it might be, which could be said to buck the trend in poor social mobility in this country. Because as Estelle says, if you can paint a positive picture, it's very rare you get a positive social mobility story in Britain. If you can paint a positive picture, then you can start to look for the things that you might be able to replicate and give everywhere else hope. That search for social mobility gold spots kept coming back time and time and time again to this city, not just in terms of schools, by the way, but in terms of programmes and also the way that businesses are engaged and all sorts of other things came back to this city. I'm sure London isn't the only place where gold spots exist in social mobility, and as politicians sometimes we may be guilty of finding it easier to spot things which are within visibility of London SW1. But nevertheless, it seems to be a bit more than a coincidence. The general pattern, everyone in this room will know, in terms of school performance in this country at GCSE level has been up, and that's the England excluding London line over the years. 2004 was the year that equivalences became allowable towards the total, but overall it has kept on going up. What isn't quite so well understood, it will be by people in this room, but not so much outside, is the extent to which, as Estelle was saying, London started off behind and overtook. I say it's not very well known. Actually, it's funny, when I talk to other MPs about the gap in social mobility and education results between London and the rest of the country, it's amazing how many of them think you're talking about the other way round, that London actually lags the rest of the country, when in fact, of course, everybody involved in the sector knows that it's very strongly the case the other way. I put a little sort of sun-like thing over 2003, because also, as Estelle mentioned, the crossover point actually happened at the same time as London Challenge was being put in place. And of course, if you were doing GCSEs in 2003, you've spent the previous 15 years not in the London Challenge. So there was something which was already obviously improving in London before then. That was GCSEs overall, but the difference really becomes stark when you isolate children defined as disadvantaged, in this case by free school meals. So this isn't a politician chart. The scales are the same on the left and right, although they don't go to zero, so it's kind of a politician's chart. But you can see that overall London does better, a bit better, but in terms of children on free school meals, it does considerably better. To put it into words, London disadvantaged children outperform non-London disadvantaged children even before school begins. So even before you're measuring Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 and so on, to the extent you can rely on early years data, there already seems to be a little bit of a gap among disadvantaged children. And then that gap grows as the school years progress through Key Stage 1, 2 and 4. And by the time you get to Key Stage 4, if you're a child on free school meals in London compared to one outside London, you are 50% more likely, I think it's a 16 percentage point gap, 50% more likely to reach the key benchmark of 5 or more at C or above, with including English and maths. You're then twice as likely to be in university when you get to age 19. And possibly, and this becomes a little bit more speculative, you're up to 4 times more likely to be at a top university. I say it's a bit more speculative because the numbers, you're starting to talk about quite small numbers of students, because although it may be 4 times as much, it's only 4%. So it's kind of 4% versus 1%, the numbers are rounded. But nevertheless, it's clear there is a significant difference between the two. So, is it about London Challenge? Well, I mean, I think what I would say is, yes, definitely. There are a number of things, many good things, about London Challenge, which, you know, what's not to like? You would certainly do them. But one of the things we wanted to bring to the party in this report was to say, look, there's actually quite a lot of people have done some work already on what was great about London Challenge and how you'd replicate it, and there's other people in this room who are doing further work on that question. What we wanted to add to that was to say, well, what actually if there's also something else? And there's a danger that you miss some of the additional stuff that might be going on. And there are reasons to believe that London Challenge alone is not the whole story. First, because as we saw on the chart a minute ago, the improvement starts before 2003 and in fact crosses over in 2003, which was the year that London Challenge for secondary began. Of course, London Challenge for primary began in 2008. Secondly, because the London premium, the difference is so much greater among disadvantaged children. And thirdly, because, as I say again, to the extent you can rely on these assessments, because it seems that even before the child is going through school, there seems to be some sort of attainment gap already. And even within London Challenge, you have to focus hard on isolating what would be the key factors that worked, because I think it's fair to say it didn't translate as well when it went to Manchester and to the Black Country in the form of the City Challenge. So the argument in the report is, let's be open-minded. We don't pretend in our reports that we have all the answers. What we say we do have is some of the questions, and I think that's, I hope, what we can contribute, both about, you know, what are the individual elements of the approach to schools, but also the more general exceptionalism of London in all its forms. And just to put some points about that, the exceptionalism, what is different about London? Well, we start here with what's not different. And these are all things that quite a lot of people actually in the education world even think or say probably are different about London. But it turns out they seem not to be. So we don't seem to have smaller class sizes. We don't seem to have children starting in formal early years settings earlier. We don't seem to have more teaching assistants. We don't seem to have we don't have teachers on average higher up the grade scale. We definitely don't have less deprivation. There's a lot of children on free school meals in London. And it's not even that London schools have just got smarter and savvier, partly because of all the journalists living next door at playing the system and knowing how to squeeze the most out of it. But then there are some things that are different, actually quite a lot. And starting with some things about the resident population. And I stress that we have to be very cautious about suggesting causality with any of these things. We just don't know. You know, you can enumerate 24 things which are significantly different about London, but you can't say from that therefore these are the things, or a subset of these are the things that are causing the difference. Some of them could be entirely spurious, but I think most of them are worthy of some investigation. I mean, one of the dominant features, even not dominant factors, is you've got a much more diverse population in terms of the ethnic makeup of London. It's radically different from England as a whole. And some of the other things that are different about London might be proxies for ethnicity or proxies for recency of arrival in the case of new immigrant groups and so on. But some of the things up there, so you've got more languages spoken, obviously. Maternal education or parental education seems to be a little bit better in London than it does elsewhere to a higher degree. And you've also got families using more tutors, for example, which again seems to be more prevalent in some groups than others. So there's a bunch of things about the resident population. There are also a number of things which are fairly obviously, when you think about it, different structurally about London, the city. Density is pretty blindingly obvious when you think about it, but then density in turn produces a number of other differences. Distances are shorter. That makes school choice easier. It means that for teachers, for new groups of new graduate teachers, for example, you have network effects and all sorts of things. And of course, operationally, and Estelle was talking about, you know, having schools working together, operationally that is a lot easier when they're very nearby, when you can walk there rather than have to drive. There's also differences in opportunities. Obviously, you have leading firms which create a pull factor, and because of the underground and, you know, public transport systems, you're more likely to be mixing with all sorts of people on a daily basis. And one of the things we put out there as a hypothesis is just the fact that there are more university places to fill means more university places get filled. Because although people maybe think about undergraduates going away to study somewhere else, actually 2/5 of students go less than 24 miles. And the average distance that a student goes to university is 59 miles. And by the way, Oxford and Cambridge are both a little bit less than 59 miles from London, whereas, of course, they're a couple of hundred miles away from the northeast. On your chairs, there's a little handout with some of the detail on some of those factors just exploded out a bit more. So, look, this is not an econometric study. It's not science, and Becky would not be allowed to produce a piece of work that said seems very likely, but that's the sort of degree of certainty we are working with here. What we've done is taken the data we have, the analysis we've done, most of which, by the way, is pretty shallow. We're not academics, we're not McKinsey and Company. We've done a certain amount of work and put out some hypotheses. But we've taken that and we've speculated to a degree about what seem to be, or seem likely to be, the most important factors. And it starts with this group of things about the city itself, which by definition are kind of harder to replicate. So on the higher up you are on this square, rectangle, supposedly the easier it would be to replicate a factor, and the further you are towards me, the more likely we think this factor is to be causal in London's outperformance. So even with these things that are harder to replicate, maybe it is possible to replicate them to a degree. So if you want more people to go to university, maybe build more universities in some of our great cities outside London. Maybe it's possible to make more of links with industry and employer schemes and so on. And maybe in other cities it's possible to make more of the commonwealth, the cultural capital that certainly is there in quantities in many of our great cities. The second group, also quite hard to replicate by definition because it's about the resident population, but feels like there must be quite a lot in it in terms of causality, even if you can't isolate precisely that it's this factor rather than that. First of all, because of this radically different makeup of the population, both in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of English as an additional language, where 48% of children at the end of primary school in London now do not have English as their mother tongue. There are also some differences about family structures, maternal education, we were just talking about age of mother at childbirth, all this sort of thing, some of which, again, may be proxies for something else and not causal in their own right. And then finally, I've written hours. In fact, it's not that London schools have longer hours, but London families use more tutors. And so perhaps it is possible to replicate that in terms of, in other ways, through the formal state education system. And then our third group, which ought to be, and is, I think, the most replicable, is the things about the school system itself. And Becky has done quite a lot of work on spend per pupil and the sorts of things that money go on, so I'm not going to try and compete with her knowledge on it. But it's interesting that although there's more money that goes into schools in London, of course you have to afford London weightings and salaries, and actually class sizes are not smaller. So the number one thing that people tend to assume you get with more money, i.e. smaller classes, doesn't seem to happen. And in fact, the gap in funding per pupil is not quite as stark when you adjust it for intake. So when you take sort of high, medium and low proportions of free school meal children as your X factor. But nevertheless, obviously, if you have more money, you can do more things. And that's why it's kind of both up there and also in the kind of should be possible to replicate. On the far right top corner is individual school turnarounds. And there are a relatively small number of schools in London who have had the most spectacular turnarounds. And so and primarily sponsored academies. And so they are although they are relatively small in number, it has quite a big impact on the numbers. And clearly, whatever else you're going to do in the education world, it has to revolve around things that happen in individual schools. And then there's three other things up there about system leadership and co-ownership, which Estelle talked about very effectively in terms of Tim Brighouse and his team, but also the way that schools felt they collectively owned this problem. And perhaps because of the history of Ilya and all the rest of it, perhaps there was more of a tradition in London of having that feeling of ownership. That's one that comes up a lot when you talk to people who know a lot and were there at the time of the London Challenge. Another thing that comes up a lot is about the data intensity. Unashamedly saying, right, I'm going to understand what is at the essence of this school. I'm going to find other schools that are like it in every respect other than its results. I'm going to use that partly to challenge, but also partly to encourage and partly to inform those other schools to help them all get up to that same level. And then finally, something about workforce. And there does seem to be, again, it comes up quite a lot, a positive disruptive influence that you have from having new people coming into teaching. And Teach First is relatively small numbers of people, but they are quite heavily concentrated in London. And you have to imagine that there is a positive disruptive potential to having new graduates coming into a school and saying, can you come and watch me teach? Can I come and watch you teach? Are there some different things we can do? So as I say, we're cautious in the extreme about suggesting causality for any of these things, but I hope in discussion a little later we might get some other views and thoughts on what is the essence of the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Damien. We're going to ask Becky Allen to speak up next, who's going to give a response to what she's heard and what she's read from Estelle and Damien, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to respond on this excellent work about one of the great successes of our education system, London's secondary schooling. And it is a success that I believe other regions in England can learn something from, and they can aim to replicate this success. But I'm going to argue it really isn't easy. What I like about the presentation and the work that the group has done is that it emphasises that the story of change in London for children, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, might be really complex. We have some policy interventions that we think were successful, academies, Teach First, London Challenge, that were principally taking place in London more than they were anywhere else. But we also have this taking place against a background of real social change. Changes in ethnic mix, gentrification, and changes in the teacher workforce that in part are just a function of social change that was taking place in London over the decades that we're talking about. The second thing I really like about this report is it just emphasises that the data might not always be as convenient to policymakers and others such as me who hope that education policy reforms can change schools and change lives as we might want it to be, because there clearly was stuff happening. There was a pattern of improvement taking place prior to the reforms we're talking about in 2001 too. So, because I hope this is a topic that your group won't leave behind, I'm going to suggest as I talk a few additions I would like you to think about. And one thing that strikes me when I look on the data in London is just there were small pockets in London where these improvements in secondary schooling didn't happen. And they didn't happen at all. There was an area in the far south, down around, in and around Croydon, an area up in the northwest corner of London. I don't know why improvements didn't happen there. But I think if you want to understand what made Tower Hamlets and Hackney and Islington and Waltham Forest so receptive to large improvements in their schools, we also need to understand what held these areas back, given that these were areas that should have had such similar potential opportunities. But to return to these policy interventions, now, I do believe the policy interventions transformed secondary schools in London. The reason why I believe that is that when you go and look at the data on the London primary schools, they weren't going through the same kind of transformation compared to the rest of England over the same period of time. And so if we want to assert this story that this is just about social change, this is just about teacher labour markets, we should see it happening across all schools in London, and we don't see that. We see a contrasting story where London primary schools are improving, but improving the same way that the rest of the country is improving, but something very different is happening in London secondary schools to the rest of the country. We do have to be careful about how we interpret the impact of these policies. I think we think of these policies, Teach First, Academies, London Challenge, they have genuinely positive evaluations of their success. So they had relatively large, some of them, impacts on particular secondary schools and particular departments within those secondary schools. And yet, when you kind of add up everything that was happening as a result of these specific policies, you can end up concluding that they had quantitatively quite a small impact overall on London's GCSE results. I mean, so for example, you take Teach First. I've done some work on Teach First, had a positive impact. It was quite a large impact for any particular secondary school department that received Teach First participants. But they make a tiny, tiny contribution to the overall improvement in London schools. And the reason why is the programme itself, at least until a few years ago, was actually relatively small. So you're taking a programme that's effective in a small number of schools, and then you're averaging across the several hundred secondary schools in London, and you end up saying Teach First can't really be the story, even if in itself it was a successful policy. And the same is true for academies. So, you know, there were large improvements in headline results in academies, particularly in academies that were sponsored by large chains. And I think this echoes Estelle's theme about schools working well in collaborative groups and not on their own. But again, once we average across the hundreds of secondary schools in London, that impact starts disappearing. And in the case of London Challenge, it's actually quite hard to say too much about exactly how successful it was, in the sense that it was a complex mishmash of interventions, and in that sense it's hard for us to disentangle how successful any individual part of it was. So, you know, I believe these policies did contribute somewhat to the success of London schools. Their policies around teacher labour market reform, their policies all around school turnaround. I'm less sure how successful they're going to be in other regions and how successful they can be. Estelle mentioned that policies are interdependent. They may need each other to make them work. And I think we need to remind ourselves of this as we pick and choose the bits and pieces of policies that we want to test out elsewhere. But I think also policies and social context or social change don't really have separate impacts on schooling systems. I think London had some critical social preconditions that allowed policies to work well. The first one I think is really important is that it had pupils and families that had increasingly high aspirations for their children. Part of this might have been a story around a big change in the ethnic mix in London schools, but it may have also been just a reflection on the fantastic local job and educational opportunities the children can see. In a sense, London children rationally have very positive aspirations because they see great things that they can achieve with their educational success in this city. And I think that positive aspirations are just the things that allow children and allow families to grasp the educational opportunities that are made available to them. And in that sense, I think they're an essential criteria for making policies work. And the second thing that London had increasingly was that the teacher labour market changed. And whether that was through increases in London waiting, we had key worker home schemes, we just had changes taking place in the choices that young people were making about where they want to live and where they want to work. All of that meant that over this long period of time, it was no longer the case that London teachers would take a job and then aim to leave the capital as soon as they could so they could go and buy a house elsewhere. London schools changed, and the result was that teacher turnover in London schools isn't really any higher anymore than it is elsewhere in the country, or barely higher. And London schools don't have the high vacancy rates that historically they suffered from. The reason why this is important to policies, if you think about something like Teach First and what makes it successful, well, it's successful because when a Teach First participant has completed their 2 years in a London school, they choose to stay in a London school after that. And when Teach First participants arrive in London schools, they are being mentored by a generation of teachers who are vibrant and excited about supporting them in their development, and in turn learning from new entrants into the profession. And similarly, academy turnaround, a really important part of what was happening was that new heads were put in place and they were confident that they were able to hire new teachers who were going to be supportive of what they wanted to do in these schools. You know, so for me, if you choose to do more work in this area, and I hope you do, I hope you answer these two big questions. How can we raise aspirations for children who live in communities where they can see so few opportunities to translate their educational qualifications into a successful career within their local community? And how can we persuade outstanding teachers that they can have a great teaching career in schools that are located so far away from policy dynamism and influence? And I think I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. fantastic. Thank you so much, Becky. We're going to open it up now to Q&A. If you could indicate your name and where you're from or who you're representing, and then we can, if you have a question to somebody specific on the panel, please let them know, or if it's just a general question. So who would like to ask a question? Yes, gentleman there. Yeah. Sorry, just wait for the mic. Sorry.
Yes, my name's Joe Dilger, educational governance consultant and former head of governance for Oasis Academies. And my question is two parts, really. Did the all-party group come across, firstly, any evidence of governor's role, hopefully positive, in terms of the very positive story around London Challenge and the achievements, in terms of any evidence of governors contributed and governing bodies contributing there? And secondly, with this London Challenge being based in London, any evidence in terms of aspirations, increased social mobility, resulting from the various schemes run by some banks and law firms to try and get young people looking at careers in places they may not have seen from, like, it's done with, I think, Mulberry School in Tower Hamlets is one example that various banks and law firms work with. Thank you.
We'll just take another question. Anyone else have a question, and then we'll answer them in a group. Yeah, gentleman there.
I'm James Kempton from Centre Forum. We're doing a piece of work looking at London challenges and how it might be applied elsewhere. But I was also leading the education change in Islington for 10 years over this period. Just 3 points for me. I mean, Estelle, you talked about leadership as being really important. It just seemed to me that that leadership issue, we think it's really important in terms of schools changing. And I wonder whether it didn't come up on Damien's slides particularly, but it seemed to be that the leadership element is quite important here. Secondly, that question about affluence and opportunity in London does seem to me to be a really essential part of the mix. And I wonder what other people's views on that were, the point that Becky made. But finally, I was interested that competition didn't come up. It seems to me that actually the spirit of competition, both between schools and between boroughs to drive up performance, was a real change over that period. And I'd be interested in people's views on whether that really is a driver as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Damien, why don't we start with you? So we've got governor's role, aspirations, leadership, opportunities, and competition and choice.
Very good. I mean, the short answer on the governors is no, we didn't look at it. So, I mean, I'm sure there is a positive role, but with a lot of these things, you kind of feel there probably is a factor. But we were trying to find things that you could measure, at least to some extent, and we didn't manage to do that with that. Similarly, with firm schemes, there definitely are a lot more firm schemes in London at social mobility than there are elsewhere. In fact, I think if you're in Tower Hamlets, there's a danger you may get smothered with firms schemes. You know, bankers popping up here, there, and everywhere. But we didn't find any particular kind of, you know, positive evidence one way or another. There's sort of intuitively it would make sense that must have a positive impact. On leadership, I'm not the expert. Estelle is, but we didn't find. A lot of people bring it up again, leadership, and a lot of people say that, including colleagues of mine in Parliament who were in education, that there was this relentless focus on quality of leadership and even almost ruthlessness. I mean, that's probably not the right word, but really, really kind of intense scrutiny. I tried to find out if there were historic figures for head teacher turnover, which would suggest that in that period there was more turnover of head teachers in London than elsewhere. And the figures just don't exist, apparently, or they're not available from the DFE. So it wasn't possible to kind of demonstrate that either way. On competition, sort of at a tangent, I mean, I think clearly the fact that London schools are closer together, you're going to get more competition. It's easier to cross borders and so on. But of course, and of course that coincides with liberalising school choice for parents, which is a key enabling factor. On boroughs, I think possibly the interesting data type point is that if you're a leafy county area, then the focus on poorer children doesn't, in inverted commas, need to be so great for your results to be great. There is there's a correlation. It's not a perfect correlation, but there is a correlation between the proportion of your overall population who are free school meal recipients and the size of the gap, an inverse correlation, obviously. So if you've got lots and lots of children who are classed as disadvantaged, you can't get a good overall result unless you're getting a good result for them, and that must have an impact on how much focus goes in.
Estelle, anything on...
Just on that, Ofsted did a really good report on that we published
Hidden
about
children,
June. If anyone's interested, it's really worth looking at. On the governors, you know, it's amazing how we forget to look at the governors, and yet we know how important it is. So I think you've raised a good point. But if I could tie one important thing up with leadership, I think the most important thing the governor does is appoint the head. And if they get that appointment right, the head appoints the staff, and that's where you've got quality. And I don't know, but I'm only guessing because I've not done any work either. But one of the things about London Challenge was, I suspect within the law, the governors weren't exactly left to their own devices to appoint the head. They had an awful lot of good quality, looking over the shoulder and making good introductions. And don't forget, at academy level, I think I'm right in thinking in that period, the heads were centrally recruited to a pool by the Department for Education and then were allocated to a school. Far tighter than any local authority would legally be able to do in their own area. I think this is quite a big thing, because you've got a governing body that lacks confidence. The fact that they don't either spot an underperforming head or appoint a strong head means they never stand a chance. And I think one of the things it did, just by having bodies around and looking at the data and keeping your eye on them, I think they reduced the incidences where governing bodies were allowed, inadvertently, not because they wanted to appoint heads that weren't good for the school. And the only other point I'd take up on perhaps 2 points, the other thing on the leadership, was that I think one of the things that excited me most, and what really excited me even more than that, is that they're still doing it despite the fact that London Challenge isn't there, and that's important, is that whatever level you were as a head, you had a next level to achieve for. So whether it was good to great or whatever, and they've all got names like this. This notion of we can all improve but still not be good enough was very openly talked about amongst heads. They knew where they, like kids, they knew where they were on the programme. They knew what they were aiming for. And I think that freed them up to talk to other professionals, which helped them. And I think competition did help, but I think the key thing here was that it didn't threaten the collaboration. And very often the competition denies the collaboration. So competition existed, but what was, I think, really good was it existed alongside the collaboration.
Becky, you've done some work on choice and competition in schools more generally. Any observations on that?
Yeah, so, and it's really hard to make claims that it's the competition in London that makes the schools effective, not least because competition is greater where there's higher population density, and there's all kinds of other things that go on in areas of higher population density. But also, when we're talking about London, let's remember we have to have a story of change, and London always had high population density, and yet it didn't always have good schools. So we can't talk about a story of competition quite like that. One thing I would say that was happening is 2005 onwards, we've had shrinking school secondary roles, and I think as somebody who's been a governor in 2 different schools over that period of time, we've been acutely aware of how difficult it's been over this period of time to maintain our Year 7 pupil roles. So we have felt the school competition over this period of time more than year by year by year in an attempt to stay afloat. We're just about to breathe a sigh of relief because the secondary school roles are about to start rising again, so we can take our foot off the marketing effort.
Okay, great. Questions, please. Yes, lady there.
Hi, I'm Meg Hillier, and I'm one of Damien's vice chairs on the all-party group. And I represent Hackney South and Shoreditch. So the London Challenge was summed up for me by the fact that when I started representing Hackney in 2000, people came to me to see how they could get their child to a school somewhere other than Hackney. And now they're all fighting to get into Hackney schools and lament the fact that they can't. But I just wanted to pick up on a couple of issues around leadership. Hackney's been ruthless, and in fact, as a commissioning authority, we now have the Learning Trust was set up because Hackney had such a problem with its education authority. It's now back in the council, but still now called Hackney Learning Trust because the brand worked. And it's a commissioner, really. So if there is a problem with leadership, it's in there. In fact, the heads very quickly report results that are problematic straight to the Learning Trust because they know the Learning Trust will be on their back. So it has sort of informally, I suppose, because legally now it's in an interesting position, but it has this very clear role. And a bad head does not last in Hackney. Or a head just, maybe not bad, but they're just not performing right for that school. The deal is done, they're out, and it's done very quickly, very brutally, that's when parents come to my surgery saying, oh, the nice head's gone. And you go, well, children at the lower levels of the school, you know. And that's exactly the point that Damien raised about the aiming children up. And then the other thing is collaboration. Hackney talks about the family of Hackney schools. So whether it's been academies, free schools, local authority schools that have changed their status, some haven't. We've got Orthodox Jewish schools in North Hackney. Whatever the model, Hackney's just made them work together. Not made them, they've chosen to, but with a bit of a nudge and a push here and there. We've got a lot of executive heads. An interesting thing that we may want to look at in future about federations and how that works, because they can have problems if something goes wrong, but they're doing some quite good things too. So I'm not sure we're saying we've got it all right. We still have too high a percentage of Hackney children overall not getting 5 good A to Cs. Let's not forget that we're talking about this as a great success story, but in some schools you've still got 35-40% not getting them. So I think we've got more to do, but we don't take our foot off the pedal, and it's been interesting to see it happen from a political perspective as well as a parent, in fact.
Great, thank you very much. And yes, the one over there.
Hello there, Louise Bamford from the RSA. And the RSA is currently doing some work with a couple of local authorities outside of London, in Suffolk and up in the northwest. So we're really interested in this discussion and what we can learn for those areas outside London. But I just had 2 queries. I don't want to be the voice of gloom in the room, but just 2 queries. The first to Becky, you mentioned positive aspirations in London, and I just wondered what the evidence base was behind that. So I'm just thinking of the fairly substantial work that the JRF did looking at different aspirations in London, Nottingham and Glasgow, and didn't really see that kind of picture of London being more aspirational than the rest of the country. So just a query about the evidence behind that. And then just a query for Damien about social mobility and the idea that London's a hotspot for social mobility. And my query is, what's the evidence that the bottom 2 quintiles in London have really benefited? So can we see higher educational outcomes translating into higher labour market outcomes? And I'm thinking in particular of ethnic minority groups who, as we know for a long time, have been more likely to stay on in education, but then we don't see it translated into higher labour market outcomes. So I just wonder, is there the evidence for the bottom 2 quintiles that it really is a social mobility hotspot? Thank you.
Okay, great. And then one more question. Yes, Jonathan.
Hello, I'm Jonathan from Teach First. So very interesting to hear all the reflections. It's really interesting about the role that Teach First might have played in this. And I think over the last 10 years, Teach First has placed 2,000 teachers in schools in London, kind of focused on those schools with the highest density of pupils from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. We would definitely be the first to say that we're not the solution to the change in London, but hopefully been a small cog in the wider change machine. But what I wanted to pick up on actually was exactly what Becky said, which I think is one of the key challenges that we're facing absolutely. And is that, so at the moment we have roughly 50% of our teachers not in London, so around the regions of England. And so hopefully we're starting to kind of build that base that you talked about of a history of teachers who can kind of mentor and train the next cohorts that come through from us. But as you say, very much one of the key things that we're thinking about at the moment is how do we incentivize and support and encourage our teachers to do their 2 years in the more rural and isolated locations, and then want to stay there rather than move to the bright lights of London. So I would love any tips you've got you can help us on one of those challenges that we are kind of thinking through ourselves.
Okay, great, thank you very much. So we had observations on Hackney, question about aspirations in London specifically, labour market benefit of the lowest 2 quintiles, and why do all Teach Firsters come to London? Becky, start with you this time.
Okay, so I mean on the aspirations, it was actually a slide in your larger pack that I was basing my comments about aspirations on. So perhaps we just need to find it afterwards to show you where the data source was. So I don't know quite what else to respond to. Oh, so I mean, you know, my personal view is that we can't just give people money to stay outside London. I don't think pay is the story. I think there's a lot that makes London a really exciting place to teach. And I think you have to put support networks in place. You know, I would argue Teach First probably needs to experiment around this and needs to experiment in areas where it's got a reasonable density of Teach First participants going in and needs to try things out. I think the work that you're trying to do in Bournemouth is an example of that. But I think we talk about, I mean, what happens to the Teach First participants is that those who stay in teaching, some of them then go and start up educational charities and support networks, and all of these things make it fun to be a teacher in London and to feel that you're learning. And so I think it's not easy, and money is probably not the answer, but I hope you'll continue to experiment in that area. And just one comment on local authorities in London and why they may intervene more quickly than others. They're some of the smallest local authorities in the country, and they know their schools. And if a secondary school is screwing up, it actually really matters that they sort it out. You contrast that with the large county local authorities, where they barely go and visit once a year. And perhaps it's no surprise that they're not quick to realise that there's problems in schools.
Estelle?
The only question I pick up is of that, because they're all interesting comments, was the Teach First, because you might do a bit of work as well, because I mean, this is really anecdotal, there's absolutely no evidence base at all, but I did a session with Teach First in the Northeast, and I just got the feeling that the Teach First students there were just as bright, just as you said it, were struggling a bit more than the ones in London. And what I wondered is, turn the question the other way around. What is it like to be a Teach First teacher without London Challenge? Because we always say Teach First contributed to London Challenge. I think London Challenge contributed to Teach First. Does that make sense? And I think in some of the other regions, the North East is the best because it never got to be part of any city challenge, and it's not got the ethnicity, it's neither got the internal nor the external mobility, and it's got a labour market that is different than any other region. And I'd be really interested, this is really totally anecdotal, but I just got the feeling from that one evening that it was quite a bit tougher to be a Teach First teacher in Middlesbrough, Sunderland, Newcastle, Hartlepool, and areas north. So that might be a good additional bit of research.
Damien,
just very briefly, I mean, to Louise's point on, you know, can you track this through and say with certainty that there are better job opportunities for people from minority groups and the bottom two quintiles? I don't know if you yet can actually. These are leading indicators that we are talking about, and annoyingly, with everything to do with social mobility, you can't answer a question conclusively until 40 years have passed, which is slightly sort of dissatisfying. But we do know that you know, success at school translates into higher education participation, and we do know in turn that higher education participation is, you know, a massive swing factor in terms of sort of later social mobility and getting on in life. In terms of the aspiration, I think Becky maybe was talking about that. We had one slide talking about, there was some questions from the LSYPE survey. Yeah. And there's one question which asked, you know, the extent to which you agree with this statement, that doing something I enjoy is more important than doing something which will help me get a job later on. And it was just interesting that on every question actually in the LSYPE that we looked at, London was either at the top end or the bottom end. It was never in the middle. And on that question, London kids, 13-year-olds, were the least likely to say, I mean, not half as likely, but less likely than elsewhere, to say that it was more important to do something they enjoyed than something that was effectively going to build their career. Now, that could be a proxy for all sorts of other things, of course, to do with family or religion or, you know, who knows what. But I think it does say something about aspiration. On Teach First, I think one of the really interesting questions is the extent to which young graduates wanting to go to London is driven by A, London, or B, other young Teach First graduates going to London. And it's probably a combination of the two, because you want friends, you know, you want the sort of people to whinge to and people to drink with, and, you know, all sorts of considerations. And I'm very excited about what you're doing in Bournemouth, and I hope we'll learn something from it. But I want you to do it in Manchester. I want you to pick somewhere bigger, where, you know, has got some of the London stuff as well, in terms of a big city, lots of excitement, lots of opportunities, but also you get that kind of network effect rather than trying to go to, you know, lots and lots of different places.
Can I just abuse Chair's privilege very quickly before we ask the first question of the next round? Just taking us off schools for a minute. One of the things I was really, really interested in this report is it sort of takes us beyond the whole kind of, it was about schools. And Damien, you have some really interesting things about kind of ethnic mix in London, recency of arrival. Yeah. And I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that. And it is a complicated area because you're never quite sure of the causality and you're never quite sure of what you're proxying for. But really, really interested to the extent in which you think just the people going to London schools and the people whose children go to London schools is perhaps a factor in London schools' growth. So that's my question, but we'll take a couple others from the audience as well now for people. Yes.
Thank you. Pam Tatlow from Million Plus, we're a university think tank. I do think university education departments and teacher education departments might have contributed to the mix as well. It wasn't just Teach First. I mean, I'm slightly living a bit of a parallel universe because I was working for an education union up till about 2002, linked with with London. And there was an issue about local authority leadership, actually. And I don't think we should take that. So it's no surprise that Tower Hamlets and Hackney and other places came through. But we've got to remember that maybe London was particularly amenable to the kind of Tim Brighouse, David Wood agenda. Because actually, you know, if you negotiate or if you're doing stuff in London, you're dealing with 32 boroughs and the corporation, the City of London. And you know, I don't know that there was that much competition, particularly between boroughs, but what there was politically, Estelle, was a lot of criticism. You know, it was almost like the shame and blame game at national level. And I think that partly that was turned round by the more collaborative approach, the raise and praise approach that Tim Brighouse and David Wood brought to the agenda outside of the political discourse. Now that's partly anecdotal, but I would wonder if the extent to which you've tracked availability on higher education, for example, more than you have, because that's shown up in the ONS statistics. You know, the increase in the number of young people going to university, studying at university in the 2000s is absolutely in London. And the resident population in London, it's out of this world, and it's partly linked, it must be linked to the kind of stuff that was going on in schools as well. But the leadership at local authority level was very different in some places.
Okay, thank you very much. And then last question. Forrester fans. The woman there in the blue dress, yeah.
Hey, Emily Hodgson from the Social Mobility Foundation. I was interested to hear Becky's comments about raising aspirations outside of London. How do you think we can do that beyond the factors that we can't really change, things like the infrastructure in London, the job opportunities? Our experience of promoting our programmes outside of London is that the teachers tend to be less receptive, less likely to promote the programmes to their students, maybe feeling that London is too far away, too much of ambition for them. Have you got any ideas about how we can go about doing that?
And go on, just take one more. Yes, gentleman right at the back there.
Hello, my name's Clive Booth. I work on behalf of Professions for Good, but I wasn't here on behalf of that. I'm here because I was a school governor at the Greycoat Hospital School in Westminster, an all-girls school, and let me tell you that the parents and children's pester power is fierce. All those children, in spite of their social backgrounds, do really, really well. I think we had a motto as "we will not fail." Now, when your Board of Governors actually approaches that, and every waking moment, that's what their lodestone is, "we will not fail," it puts you under a degree of pressure. So I was very interested a few weeks ago when I went to Redcar, where my family come from. Hands up if you know where Redcar is, everybody? Not enough. Okay, well, Redcar is on the northeast coast. It was a former, well, basically it's a ghetto of people who are out of work in the steelworks. And one of the teachers there, who I'm friendly with, I went to university with her, she said, "Nobody gets jobs at my school, and my teacher doesn't know how to get us jobs." So I'm here tonight to wonder whether the goldspots campaign can possibly do anything at all to even half the children in Redcar in the school that my friend works at, because their future is bleak. And forget how successful London is, children in Redcar will become grown-ups, and they will then just perpetuate the disaster that's happening over there. Thanks.
Okay, great. So we've got something about the people in the ethnic mix in London, local authority leadership, and is it an end to the blame game? Potentially something again about kind of raising aspirations, something on higher education, and then what do we do about areas like Redcar, perhaps not just specifically Redcar, but Redcar as an epitome of some of this issue. Let's start with Estelle this time.
Of the local authorities, they were changing. I mean, 2001, 2002, we were about 5 years in to dealing with underperforming local authorities. So the culture changed, the message going out. The Trust Hackney was actually our second attempt because the first time we outsourced it and it didn't work. So the Trust was something that was developed after. That's how sort of bad it got. I don't, looking back, I'm sure I'm right about this, there were some emergingly good local authorities at that time, but some still hadn't got the message. I tend to think that the good thing about London Challenge, I'm not saying it bypassed that leadership, but it gave educational leadership where local authorities weren't doing so. And I think that was a good thing. And eventually, most local authorities, I think, became very strong partners with London Challenge and played a good role. But I've absolutely no shadow of doubt that had that action not been taken from 97 onwards with failing local authorities, and London Challenge not gone in, it wouldn't have happened. So I think local authorities were a problem in London in 97 and through a number of ways they came through. I'm really passionate about Sunderland, actually, which is just a little part away from Redcar, partly because I worked at the university up there for 3 years when I left Parliament, and I still go up there quite a lot. And you're absolutely right, and there's a real issue there as to why, you know, certainly that we didn't get that right. That many of our initiatives never got to the northeast. And I tell you what I think, it's a really tricky issue for us. And it's, you know, we're going back 10, 15 years. The ethnicity is so low that when you look on the levels of deprivation, they tended not to come out as local authorities that actually were deserving of the initiatives that were around. So they didn't get as many of those initiatives. And another factor which is interesting, it's probably true of Redcar, and I think this comes into the aspiration bit. And I haven't got an intellectual answer to this, it's just a feeling. That not only isn't the internal and external emigration from the northeast, two of the factors, of all, I think this is right, but you'll tell me if I'm wrong, it certainly used to be right, of all the regions in the country, students graduating from northeastern universities are less likely to stay in the region than any other region. And you usually keep your graduates for a while. They've got 5 really good universities. They are less likely to keep their graduates than anyone else. And the other thing is, I think that a lot of the teachers in northeast schools come from the northeast as well. So they've not even got teachers who've done their 2 years in London when they were young 20-odd-year-olds and went back. So in terms of aspiration and where they're getting the messages from, yeah, and I just want to pick up one more thing, David, because it's a word you had on there that you didn't, because no need to draw attention to, but it was your shorthand for cultural capital, and it was museums. And I think one of the other interesting things that's happened over the years in the same decade is the absolutely fantastic improvement in the arts in the capital and the museums and the theatre. And you're beginning to get that with the Sage, but Redcar's even a long way from the Sage. So the Sage is magnificent. How many kids in Redcar manage as part of their education to use one of the 26 classrooms at the base of the Sage? So I think my summary is you're dead right to point that out, but of your diagrams, I don't think we've got the context right in which to make the education improvement. We can't hang around waiting for it, but it's the area where we really should go and get things done.
Well, as a Northeastern University graduate who now lives in London,
part of the problem.
I know, I'm definitely not part of the solution. Becky, reflections.
I have little to add except to say that perhaps Teach First is part of the answer to that, in the sense that if you want people to go and teach in northeast schools who come from parts of the country where they can tell a story about what's possible for the children, then perhaps those can be young graduates from all different parts of the country. And perhaps you can do something with data. I mean, one of the things that happens in schools now is that children are told their targets and expectations for how they're going to do all the time. Perhaps we can try and experiment around the way that we can do that for children. We can be a lot more sophisticated. I'd like us, rather than telling children what it's most likely that they're going to achieve, to tell them about children who were just like them and yet went on to achieve a lot more. And we can now just about match into the data, and we can talk about children who were just like them, who went to Russell Group universities, who were able to go and get good jobs in the labour market. And I think we have to experiment around trying to tell those sorts of stories. But they can't just be data stories, they have to be real-life human stories. And maybe bringing new teachers into the Northeast could be part of that.
Great. Damien, final reflection.
Thank you very much, John. And you asked me to say a word about the ethnic mix and recency of arrival. Of course, those are two different things, although sometimes they get conflated, but they are very different things. The ethnic mix in London is radically different from in the rest of the country. So in secondary schools, I forget the exact numbers, but somewhere around 80% of kids nationally are white British, somewhere around 30 in the 30s in London. So it's a massive, massive difference. I think we have to be very careful in then drawing inferences that say, well, because there is both a different ethnic mix and different education results, the two things are related. But you kind of can't ignore this big sort of statistical feature. And it's also true that there are some coincidences in data, some of which are in the report. So, for example, we talked about the LSYPE questions about delayed gratification. I would, the extent to which I'm willing to forego doing things I enjoy to build for my future. There are also big differences in those answers between, or sorry, no, I shouldn't say big differences. There are noticeable differences between certain different ethnic groups, and so you kind of maybe draw an inference there. Tutor use is, again, very different, very low among the white British population, and I think just about most ethnic groups actually is significantly higher than among the white British. Recency then is a different thing altogether, and the sort of proxy for recency is speaking English not as your mother tongue. And I don't think most people really realise that like half of kids in London junior schools don't have English as their mother tongue. Even if they do understand that, what they certainly wouldn't expect is that by the time those children reach GCSE, the children in London with English as a foreign language do slightly better than children for whom English is their mother tongue, which is quite an astonishing statistic. When you can, I mean, clearly it's a big sort of challenge to get over. Obviously, schools in London also get very good at educating multicultural classes and children from all sorts of different backgrounds. But there may be even more good news to come, because if you accept that English as an additional language is a sort of proxy for recency, and if you tend to intuitively think that probably first generation immigrant families are go-getters, I mean, obviously we're generalizing to a ridiculous degree, but are ambitious and so on, then actually the numbers in year 6 currently in primary school are about to translate into secondary school, where the number is currently lower. Can I make, I've taken up far too much time, but just very briefly on some of the other points. Firstly, on ambition outside London. Yeah, it is true that London's got more cultural capital, I suppose, than on average in the rest of the country, but we have plenty of great cities with plenty of great stuff in them, and including ones that have improved materially. I'm a bit obsessed about Manchester because that's where I grew up, and you're a Mancunian too. Yeah. And, if you look at the city centre of Manchester and Salford, over the last 20-odd years, it has been transformed, and with things like the BBC moving to Salford, that also ought to be possible to use as a big sort of pull factor. On teachers, I'm sure having a new card of teachers coming into an area could be a good stimulus factor. Another statistic we have in the report is the proportion of London teachers who got their degree outside the UK. So you have more internationally educated people with a whole different perspective as well. And just a little curved one to throw in, which is not in our report, but just because my wife happens to be a teacher and she obsesses about it, is the idea, whenever we talk about higher education exposure, we tend to talk a lot about whether the kids get to visit a Russell Group university and see what it's like and get over their barriers. We don't very often talk about making sure that teachers have an opportunity to see very top universities and to have whatever sort of perceptions they may have broken down. And finally, on Redcar, what I would love to do in goldspots is find the exceptions, because in Redcar and in the rest of the Northeast and all over the place, there are going to be brilliant leaders, brilliant teachers doing brilliant things, and kids with great stories to tell. And I hope that the whole kind of positivity that might come from that may be a spur to others.
Great. So book your place now for Redcar Challenge this time next year. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. So can we just have a huge great thanks to Estelle Morris, Damien Hines, and Rebecca Harris.